The Arctic shores were the next branch of the three-part Kinect Grand Prix. Ben had taken his second place starting point as the racers began cranking their engines early, though Ben did not because he remembered the course and what would happen if you heated up too early too quickly. He only gave his engine a couple of revs to warm it up, nothing to intimidate anyone or anything. The race was about to begin as the lights began along with the countdown starting at 3 and making its way down to 1 before the racers are told to go, and they all shot out from the starting position. We see why the vantage point was good to be in second place, as the ice was moving around and bears that had armor made from ice were charging at the racers. These creatures were the Tondradic Ursa. They were all running towards the racers, roaring out, and the further ahead you were, the less likely you would be the one caught, as Ben zipped past a lot of them while they were charging, and had begun attacking the racers that were too slow behind him. Ben continued the race on ahead, as he was drafting behind the number 1 spot racer, staying on their tail, while other racers had their vehicles heat up too much from all the engine revving, which made the ice and snow melt around them fast, causing some to get stuck in pits created by the melted material around them. This is why he didn't do any of that extra engine revving. The first place racer knew what Ben was doing and decided to shake them off their tail by hitting a curve at a wrong angle that caused our hero to be launched forward at a near straight up incline. Ben didn't have much of a choice then, and fired all thrusters at once, on maximum to force his way up to the top of the incline. He'd barely made it to the top of the incline and could see the entire course from there, looking around, and began plotting his course and asked 8-Ball how the absolution looked on their end, wanting to make sure that what he was planning was actually going to work before he tried it. The Kinesillaran mechanic then checked everything, running a diagnostic on the ship Ben was in, along with the course he'd plotted out. Once he'd seen everything was still in full working condition, he gave them the go-ahead to handle it. With a nod, he then began driving forward slowly as he let the momentum of his downward descent give him speed. Because Ben had shut down the thrusters for now, he was able to only rely on the speed he gained from going down that giant slope, and used that to maneuver his way around into the first place spot, and then kicked the engines back on once they were starting to slow back down to give him a boost and fly forwards a bit more in the process. They were coming up to the next part of the Arctic shore, that being the actual shore part with frozen beaches and icy cold water on one side with ice walls on the other. They'd have to be able to keep control of the situation when the Urga began to appear to feast on what's around them. Dorsal fins began to appear around in the waters as they were preparing to get a hold of the racers. Though with Ben in first, he had the best chance to avoid them because they would need to swim to shore before they could go after the racers, and he'd continued racing forwards to try to keep ahead of the others. The Urga were getting closer to shore and towards the racers, with the first 3 ahead of them and the rest a bit too far back, with the aquatic creatures appearing and grabbing the ships with long arm-like fins and tiny claw-like appendages at the end, pulling them along the ice and into the waters below to be devoured. Ben was able to hold his position in first long enough to cross the finish line, which now meant that he only had to complete the final part of the race, next up and hopefully in first place, again to win the Grand Prix. He pulled into the pit area and got out, getting a kiss from Gwen, who congratulated him for hitting first this time. They were glad that he'd made it, and 8-Ball suggested that they start using the side thrusters to handle the final leg of the Kinect Grand Prix, to which he'd nodded in response to that idea, since they would come in really handy, especially with what was going down next in the race. Gwen asked what that next race part was going to be exactly, and Ben explains that they were the lightning plane. She asked what all that would have, and Ben tells her that he'd be dodging literal lightning and Grudu Electrum as a part of the race. Seeing her confusion, he then goes on to say that he was going to be dodging Thunderwing's species as a part of the challenge, and if he could manage to keep the first this time, he'd be the overall winner of the Grand Prix. 8-Ball tells them both they could just go ahead and enjoy the second festival night, and they would handle setting up the ship for tomorrow's final leg of the race. With a nod, the two then headed on out, ready to relax and enjoy more of the festival, watching the fireworks display together and enjoying themselves. After the displays, they'd gone out to eat together. It was better than having to deal with with whatever the ship could make for them at the very least. They then spent a little more time out relaxing and enjoying the night together, talking about what they could do next after they finished here at the Grand Prix, and who they might go see next. Finally, after a while longer, they went on back to the ship and began getting ready to call it a night, so they could head off to sleep and rest, with tomorrow being a seriously big day, being the final leg of the race and all. They had gotten ready for bed, and soon went off to sleep shortly after laying down for the night.